Hi, everybody. Ooh. What I'm going to read you this afternoon is one of the 12 short stories collected in Jill. Turn it down. That better? Sounds better to me, too. One of the 12 short stories collected in Jill McCorkle's just published, it was published yesterday, um, collection called Old Crimes. Jill McCorkle is a born and bred North Carolina writer. She grew up in Lumberton and has the accent to prove it. Fabulous. She never lost it. And now she lives in Hillsborough. Let me read you this introduction to her from the advanced reading copy. Jill McCorkle published her first two novels on the same day in 1984. Of these novels, the New York Times Book Review said, quote, one suspects the author of The Cheerleader is a born novelist. With July 7th, she is also a full-grown one. Since then, she has published 5 other novels, most recently Hieroglyphics, and 4 collections of short stories. 5 of her books have been named New York Times notable books, and 4 of her stories have appeared in Best American Short Stories. She's received the New England Booksellers Award, the John Dos Passos Prize for Excellence in Literature, the North Carolina Award for Literature, the Thomas Wolfe Prize. She was recently inducted into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. She's taught at Harvard, Brandeis, and North Carolina State, and is currently on faculty at the Bennington Writing Seminars. Um, so the story I'm going to read is called A Simple Question. And you can figure out what the old crime is in this story. A simple question. There was something in the late winter light that tugged Anna's mind to that day, and she wasn't sure why. Over 25 years had passed, and yet there it was, a gray winter afternoon and a long ago friend. They were in the parking lot across from the theater, the Colonial. She remembers that part clearly. And she had to walk carefully to avoid lingering patches of ice. She wasn't wearing her boots, having opted to risk the good shoes, but then was sorry not to have the security of hard rubber traction. It was a Sunday in late February, and the whole day had felt like dusk. The show crowd had thinned, and the last of the cars were filing from the lot. They had gone to see Death of a Salesman, and while walking around before the show, had actually seen Hal Holbrook sitting in a restaurant. Was it really him? They wondered. How could he eat? They stared too long because he smiled and raised his hand. She will never forget that. The image returning so clearly with the recent news of his death. But that day, in the city with Muriel, their words and laughter muffled by scarves and coat collars, it made her recount having seen a striking man on Boylston Street years before. An elegant camel hair coat and trimmed mustache. She told Muriel she knew it was either Walter Cronkite or Captain Kangaroo, and after a stunned pause let out a loud, involuntary, Walter Cronkite! He turned, smiled, and waved, and she was so relieved she hadn't screamed, Captain Kangaroo! They laughed, and then Muriel said she had something she wanted to ask. How had she said that? I want to ask you something, or I have a question. Then she said that perhaps it would be better to wait until they were seated, or after the show, better without all the distractions. She said this when Anna stopped to study the menu of a restaurant, suggesting that they eat there sometime, perhaps the next time they met for a show. At the time, Anna was thinking a lot about her apartment, a small 1-bedroom, 4th-floor walk-up. She was thrilled not to have a roommate, but also missed having someone to share her life, someone that is, other than Muriel, who people might very well have thought was her mother. Muriel got divorced later that year, so it could have been something about that. Maybe she'd known it was coming and wanted to run her thoughts by somebody else. She often talked about her son, who had left college in the middle of his freshman year and moved back home, so that was another possibility. Anna had thought often what unlikely friends they were. Muriel was twice her age, and yet they had a lot in common. Interests, a lot of interests in common, and taught at the same junior high school, both in language arts. They both loved walking around the city, going to the theater and museums, and they both disliked their principal, a man who stood too close and explained everything in exaggerated enunciation as if talking to a toddler or dog or imbecile, Muriel had once added. Anna was barely 25 when she took that job and had known no one, so she had welcomed seeing Muriel each day, the wry glances at meetings and laughter at lunch. It had been only natural that they began to get together outside of school. In those early years, Muriel was encouraging in all ways, telling Anna she would have a host of friends in no time, that she was a stellar teacher, that she imagined Anna would soon have all kinds of dates, and then who knew where life would take her. Enjoy this window, Muriel had said, and laughed. You won't believe how quickly things can change. Muriel seemed old at the time, a husband and a child in the seventh grade, a house in the suburbs. She often brought baked goods, bread, or cakes for the break room at school. That was in the very beginning, and Anna relied on her maternal goodness, the care and hopeful future projections of what Anna's life might bring. They laughed over Anna's domestic mishaps, the time she purchased MSG for a recipe, the fact that she didn't know a dryer filter had to be cleaned, or that you shouldn't put grease down the sink. Back then, when they met, Muriel had said she was the happiest she had ever been and felt closer to her husband than she had ever dreamed possible. Their son had some challenges in school, but he was about to turn 13 and doing so much better. They had hired a tutor. They were hopeful. They were hopeful. Such a relief for him to have a friend, she had said. Anna wasn't domestic at all in those years, but she loved everything about her tiny apartment except the pigeons roosting on the windowsill and the squirrels living in the walls. At night, she could hear them, acorns rolling, nails scratching, even though the landlord had assured her that he had it all under control. He said he really doubted they would find a way into the apartment. He said it had only happened once in the 30 years he'd been there. He could set a trap, and would if it got worse, but that really is a horrible sound, he said. Not to mention that they'd be all smelling it. It's a quandary, he kept saying. And remember, squirrels are not rats, and it's almost spring. It was a breezy February day. Valentine hearts and cardboard cupids decorated the window of a stationery shop from the week before, and she recalled Muriel commenting about the groundhog having seen his shadow. More cold coming. She doesn't remember telling Muriel about the squirrels in the wall and the way she could hear them scratching right near her bed, but she must have, especially with the mention of another rodent. She recalled how she had envied those like Muriel with so much of life fixed and decided in their suburban backyards, garage doors that magically opened to a kitchen the size of her whole apartment, a life partner, a child, a pet. She was only at Muriel's home a few times, the son's bar mitzvah her first, and she was only invited because she had mentioned in the teacher's lounge that a friend had broken a date and she had nothing to do. Muriel even arranged a ride for her with another teacher in their school. Anna remembered how Muriel's husband had raised a glass and said, "Today you are a man, and tomorrow you go back to seventh grade." Muriel and her husband had stood together that day, arms entwined, their son out on the dance floor laughing with a new confidence from this moment of popularity. Another time, Anna was shopping out that way and stopped by to return a book Muriel had lent her and was invited in at what seemed a stressful time. There was an uncomfortable pause when she found the three of them in the kitchen, sitcom laughter in some distant room. The son was in high school by then, applying to colleges, smoking a lot of pot. Muriel said that every time she tried to talk to him, to understand what was going on in his life, he said, "You want to know what's wrong with me? How about what the fuck is wrong with you?" The question Anna recalls vividly was the one he had asked at his party when he was 13 and reading aloud from a book of riddles he'd received as a gift. The spotlight was on him, and it was clear that his parents were enjoying his getting attention as much as he was. There were all the silly riddles, of course, hands and legs, clocks and chairs. But the one Anna recalls was, quote, "What is the question you can ask anywhere in the world, get different answers each time, and yet always be correct?" End of quote. She could see him there, hair cowlicked, crust of chocolate cake on the edge of his mouth. He was an awkward kid who came into the room and everything was instantly topsy turvy, lampshades crooked and rugs flipped up. It seemed he was always on the verge of nervous laughter because he had a secret or knew something you didn't. In high school, there were suspensions and drugs. He told his mother that he wished he was dead, and then later he wished she was dead. Muriel had told Anna about this while they were walking Beacon Hill on the third Thursday in May, a day devoted to the annual garden tour, when they made their way along the uneven brick sidewalks to peer into tiny, often sunless spaces transformed into paradise brickwork in elaborate patterns, mirrors, and fountains and statues. They read aloud the descriptions in the program, the various plant names like incantations that might open the wrought iron gates and heavy ancient doors that led to other lives, trumpet vine and bleeding hearts, astilbe, pulmonaria, laurel, lilac, euonymus. What can a mother say to that? She asked. God. Another day, they made up their own tour based on Muriel's idea, apartments of long dead writers, three on Pinckney Street alone, Alcott and Thoreau and Hawthorne, Plath on Willow, and Frost on Mount Vernon. Muriel's idea was that they should read something at each stop, and she had books in her tote with pages carefully marked. They had stood at the foot of Pinckney Street, the river at their backs, before climbing up the hill, and it was there Muriel had pointed to a third floor bay where she had once lived with two other young teachers, a view of the river, and a preschool across the street where at recess kids, all bundled in snowsuits, held on to a long rope with a teacher on each end. If a child started to slip on the icy bricks, they yanked the rope and popped them right back up. "I wish you could have known my son when he was a toddler," she had said and smiled. But it was hard to put together the image of a windblown, bundled cherub with the awkward riddle telling boy, and especially not with that of the angry young man who wished his mother dead. "When I was your age, and up in that window," she paused, then shook her head as if to dispel whatever words were coming next, and reached for one of her many quotes selected for the day, Plath's quote, "Numb as a fossil, tell me I'm here," to Alcott's quote, "I hate ordinary people." She never let the somber tone last too long, always looking for something that might bring a smile, and perhaps that was what was different on that February day. The lifts were getting harder and harder to find. And for Anna, it was getting harder and harder to listen to the sadness and the denial in her voice, the blame of the boy's father, his teachers. It was hard to respond to the regret and grief. That episode of his freshman year, everything seemed okay, and then, how many times had Muriel told that story? He drained his bank account and out on the highway. They had no idea where he was, and it was days before he called from a motel in Tucson without any money. Her husband had called her an enabler, said he couldn't take it, and then got a divorce, a new wife, a new life. But that was all later, of course, and information Anna only heard secondhand from another teacher in the school who lived in the same town. That day at the theater, Muriel had checked her phone often, a weak smile, if she saw Anna notice. But what was the question? There's something I want to ask you, she had said. Did she wait for intermission or did they ever circle back? They had great seats, Holbrook completely transformed into Willie Loman, and afterward, when they stood in the parking lot and talked about the play, how Linda Loman said, quote, he's only a little boat looking for a harbor. They marveled at the power of those words and the effect of staring at the set, the house where they had lived and struggled, lived, while also seeing what was not on stage, the distant crash of Willie's car wrapped around a tree, the shocking end of it all. And what about those haunting last words? Quote, we're free. A mortgage all paid, something completed, and yet, Anna will remember that for the rest of her life. That February day, the sharp smell of the river ready to thaw, exhaust from the turnpike trapped in the low ceiling of gray. We're free. At some point in one of the many conversations along the way, Anna had voiced horror that Muriel's husband kept a gun locked in his closet. She had told Muriel she would never live with a gun in the house, and that it was absolutely clear her son needed treatment, perhaps serious medication or tough love, as she'd read about recently and seen on television, Oprah or Jane Pauley or somebody talking in the background while she straightened her apartment for another day and looked forward to going out with friends her own age. Finally, friends her own age, too many friends it seemed, and a relationship that would carry her into the future and her real life. I bet once he gets straightened out, his dad will want to return, and then you'll have a decision, she had told Muriel. That will be a big decision, won't it? Whether or not you let him come back. And what about someday when your son gets married? You can tell all these stories to his fiancée and everyone will laugh. Now she shudders with that memory. Muriel had smiled, or what at the time seemed a smile, as if to say, oh, yes, how smart, you're so right. As if suddenly the light blared through and she realized something she hadn't seen before. And yet now, isn't it obvious that what she was really thinking was, oh, my dear ignorant friend, you know nothing. Wait until you have children. Wait until the person you have vowed to share through thick and thin can't take it anymore. Just you wait. But she was also above saying such a thing. The words, just you wait, would not have occurred to someone like Muriel. What time is it? That was the answer to that long ago riddle, the universal question that yields different answers but all correct. A 13-year-old boy stands in the spotlight, his 5 minutes of glory, proud parents with their arms entwined, kids from school gathered around him, new suit, shiny belt and shoes, a tie purchased just for the occasion, his party, his celebration, his step into manhood. On that day, he had friends and proud parents and the gift of not knowing all that lay ahead of him. And here she is, years and miles from that day, in a town not unlike Muriel's, where children wait in front of the house for school bus to arrive, a place where the daily news reports are the kind that get laughed at by the rest of the world. Someone dumped trash in the recycling bin at the grocery store. A squirrel was in a tree acting strange. Heads of cabbage were tossed around and left on the school grounds. Why? Now standing at the sink, making the bed, staring out of the window, grading papers, the thought of all the words not spoken seizes her. Dear Muriel, she thinks, dear Muriel. And she thinks how sometimes the universe gives an answer before we understand the question. There in the dark theater, there at the end, they sat in silence. The scene plays, and even knowing what is coming, they are shocked by the crash, shocked by the humbling sense of loss and the awareness of how vulnerable each life. Muriel has been dead for several years now, her son as well, and yet each time Anna remembers, there's shock. By the time she heard about Muriel's illness, Anna was at a different school, and it was only by chance she ran into an old colleague who mentioned it. Muriel's years with her son and the sad choice he made, then her own health issues she kept to herself. This question comes to Anna. If she went to the city and walked those same steps, would she see something? Hal Holbrook in a restaurant, death of a salesman on the marquee, Willie Loman resurrected and once again filled with hopeful promises? Would she see her young single self step from her dark apartment and hurry along the city streets to see Muriel waiting there on the corner with a big smile, hands deep in the pockets of her down coat? They sat that day, elbows touching, not a sound to be heard in the theater as their minds fixed on the imagined accident in the distance, the same way her mind now can't think of Muriel's old house without seeing her son hanging there in the mudroom where a little Tykes tractor had grown invisible over the years. But that day, after the curtain call, after the lights came up, they walked outside where it was almost dark and lingered in the parking lot. It was their last outing. Anna is almost sure of that now. And what did she even do in her apartment that she rushed back to that day? She was eager to get home, hands in pockets and head bent to the coal, an urgency in her steps as she walked the many blocks. Did she stop in Blockbuster for a rental? DeLuca's for something she couldn't afford to eat? Did she call her still living parents or wait until the next day to avoid the slow blue Sundays that plagued her for much of her young life? Did she watch something mindless on TV, knit, grade papers? Did she even wonder what it was Muriel wanted to ask? Or was she distracted by the fact that there were squirrels in the walls and a pigeon roosting on her bedroom windowsill that overlooked an alley and dumpster? And she had boxes to pack, a move up ahead. She was moving into her life. It was a dark Sunday in February when she had no husband, no children, no mortgage. Her parents were alive and far away, healthy enough that she could complain about her conversations with them and not worry for a minute. She hadn't known what it felt like for a parent to die or for a marriage to feel threatened, for a child to lash out in anger. She had not known how sometimes you just need someone to listen. That day she had walked quickly, protecting those shoes she tossed out 20 years ago, then climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her dark, tiny space where an old radiator whined and some creature with no sense of time clawed at the walls to get free. That's it. So, thanks. So the rest of the stories are just as good and some even better. That was the right length. And Jill is giving readings all around town. I think the one in Durham is the 17th, and I can't remember the name of the store. What's the name of the bookstore? Yeah, I think she's going to be there the 17th. And she's going to be out at Farrington this weekend on Saturday. She's a great reader. Um, and you should hear her accent. So thank you guys. Okay. Take these off.